Pundits believe the conflict in the Middle East and its consequent disruption of oil supplies to Asia appear to be accelerating the end of the fossil fuel era in this region. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Wednesday, May 13th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. The unrest in the Middle East amid the standoff between the US and Iran is reshaping Asia's energy strategy, and South Korea is no exception. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
I also have Professor Yu Jong-min from Hongik University with us. Professor Yu, it's lovely to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Lovely. We start with Steven then. OECD member nations, Steven, saw their energy prices soaring to their highest levels in about 3 years, I believe, back in March. How high are we speaking about, and what are the immediate implications of these escalating prices?
So OECD energy inflation reached 8.1% in March, which was the highest level logged since February of 2023. It was a bit of a mixed bag across the economic groupings. I mean, these are a grouping of advanced economies, but there is some variation in the size of the member states and the orientation of the government. One thing that the data showed was inflation was a bit more moderate in countries such as Japan, where the governments tend to have aggressive implementation of measures to soften the effects of these kind of energy spikes internationally. So, I mean, the implications of this are that energy is what economic experts refer to as a master resource, in that it goes into everything. It affects the price of everything. When energy gets more expensive, it creates ripple effects across the economy, and it can really affect consumer-facing things, such as prices at the gas pump, prices of food, and on and on and on. And so, to me, the bigger kind of implication of this is that in recent years, as the cost of living has increased around the world, we've seen cost of living emerge as a political variable in a way that I think it hasn't always been. We've seen it turn elections. The elections in Canada and Australia and any number of other places have really been dominated by cost of living concerns, and incumbent administrations have faced accusations that they have not done enough to maintain affordability. I mean, President Trump himself came into office, riding a kind of wave of popular discontent over the inflation that had been recorded under his predecessor, the Joe Biden administration. And so it's somewhat ironic that Trump has undertaken this military operation that is, at the moment, stands to be, one of the largest inflation-driving international events that we've seen in recent memory. And I believe it was just yesterday he said in public remarks that he was not really keeping in mind the economic effects on ordinary Americans when deciding whether and how to continue this military operation. So we will see in the coming months. Whenever we talk about this conflict, we keep going back to this same place where what we really determine the ultimate significance of all this is just how long this conflict is prolonged. If it goes past June, I think a lot of experts have said that will be a point where we might start to see some really unfortunate effects in the form of shortages and higher prices. So, the sign is that energy is getting more expensive, but the deeper implications are a little bit further down the road.
Right, and for some better perspective, Professor Yu, how does this surge in energy prices compare to that seen perhaps at the height of Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, so from what we have seen in the economic data, it looks like a very kind of similar, but it's actually not that similar in the sense that if you split the questions into two ways, one is for how big was the physical supply, energy supply shock was given to our economy, and what had really happened to our economy indicators. In the case of war between in 2020, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, what we actually has experienced was that the natural gas delivery from the Russia to Western European countries was heavily damaged at the time. So when the natural gas has damaged, that actually make a very bad situation for the household in the European countries. And then, but even if the household in Western countries has suffered for that increased natural gas prices, but the crude oil could be rerouted to the other ports, and there was no serious effect for the crude oil effect. But in the case of our current situation right now, most of the seaborne oils was made in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf area, and also if those and also natural gas as well. If we cannot, and East Asia countries mostly bring their energies from that Hormuz Strait. And if we cannot bring those energies from that very small size of very narrow sea land, then there will be a huge problem for us. So in terms of the physical energy supply, our current event would be more serious. But in the case of economic situation, in 2022, when the Ukraine situation, we had a very bad overlapping pandemic, and just after pandemic, there was a supply shock of the energy, and also labor market was very tight. During the pandemic season, the companies had a hardship to hire more laborers, and then labor market had a very high real wages, and also all around the market, cheap money was so a lot. And then central banks has issued lots of cash, and that was pushing up the price level overall. But right now, central bank has been tightening their policies for a couple of years, and also labor market has already relaxed. So the real wage rate was a little bit low compared to the 2022, and then also what I can say is the energy supply. If we have a energy supply more than 2 months, then probably there will be bring a long shock for our expectation over our prices, and that kind of expectation will bring up the prices even more. So I'm afraid that inflation, if we have this kind of situation last more than a couple of months, then the serious problem can happen.
Right, and that because South Korea receives, of course, 70% of its crude oil from the Strait of Hormuz, as well as 20% of its natural gas. This being said, pundits believe that the current oil supply disruption is perhaps accelerating the end of the fossil fuel era here in Asia. Could you walk us through their thoughts, Steven?
I could try. This is ultimately a question for somebody who's a lot better informed than I am, but I can say that since the start of this crisis, this is a theme that has come up a lot, in that this is, since perhaps the oil shock of the 1970s, this is the global event that has really most powerfully underscored the vulnerability of a fossil fuel-based economy. You know, the fact is that there's not a lot of parts of the world that are major oil producers, and you know, if you're going to orient these huge swaths of your economy around fossil fuels, you are going to inevitably be vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. And so the idea, therefore, being that it makes sense to pivot to a model where you are less dependent on fossil fuels. And you know, there's a kind of within this question, there's the potential for a kind of democratization, in that you know, sunlight is free and wind is free, and hydro pressure can be free if it's harnessed in the right way. But you know, the idea just being that countries on an individual basis can develop an infrastructure that gives them greater energy independence. That's all well and good. That's a nice idea, but when in reporting on this and looking into this, you just constantly run up against some very big and thorny questions that, you know, complicate the question of implementation. You know, like I was in Australia at this time last year covering the election, and I went to some like former mining areas that were putting a lot of effort into going green, but talking to people there, they were very skeptical as to whether or not this was going to be able to, on any kind of near or even medium-term basis, be able to meet the energy needs of households and of industry and all the rest. There was an interesting column in the South China Morning Post that made this argument pretty strongly that the current crisis was going to accelerate the end of the fossil fuel era. And I thought it's an interesting argument, but I did think it kind of oversimplified things to an extent. I understand that opinion editors are encouraged to come up with headlines that will draw a lot of web traffic, but in this part of the world specifically, the fact remains that there are huge swaths of the economy and big parts of life that remain very dependent on fossil fuels. At Nikkei Asia, a lot of our coverage is oriented towards very big populous countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, where the average person rides their motorcycle to work every day, and they do not have at the moment the kind of infrastructure in place that would allow for a smooth and quick transition away from fossil fuel dependence. So the actual way that this plays out will probably be much more moderate. You will see some moves away from fossil fuels, but let's not count our solar panels before they're hatched or some other kind of idiom.
Right, indeed. Keeping in mind the current challenges then, Professor Yu, could you tell us a bit about South Korea's energy strategy under the Lee Jae-myung administration and your takeaways?
So I absolutely agree with what he just said. So for the people who is working like me in the energy field, we call this kind of situation as the energy trilemma. We have three objectives. One is for secure, stable energy supply. The other is affordability, the cheap energy prices. And the other thing is the sustainability. If you have environmentally friendly energy sources, then that's one thing that we need to pursue. So these three goals is very hard to achieve at once. So right now, the Korean government is trying to achieve the third goal, the sustainable energy sources. So that's why the Lee Jae-myung government is trying to set up lots of solar panels and windmills, and also the government has merged created a new government office called the Ministry of Climate, Energy, Environmental Ministry. Beforehand, it was a Ministry of Industry and Ministry of Environment, but we merged them together. That's actually reflecting the will of the President's office. So right now, even if the government has an intention to do that, Korea is basically isolated energy island. So we cannot really we cannot bring the energy like France or Germany. France and Germany, they are trading their electricity through the energy grid, but Korea is surrounded by the ocean and then blocked by the North Korea. So in order to secure our stable energy sources, we need to give up other objectives. So especially on top of that, Korea is heavily depending on the energy-heavy industry, like petrochemicals, semiconductor, steel, and shipbuilding. This kind of thing, industry is consuming lots of energy. But so if you have a energy crisis like we have these days, then it's not just a matter of the hardship of the household. It will be the problem of industry itself. So that's why the Korea is right now we are flipping our direction of our policy right now. Now coal-fired power plants is back on the table, and the government has approved the new nuclear power plant additionally. And this is actually the opposite direction of the president has campaigned during the election right now.
Right. All this being said then, Professor Yu, what tasks do you believe should be undertaken by South Korea to ensure its energy market resilience once the war in the Middle East comes to an end?
So I believe we need to solve this kind of problem before the crisis come to us. So, but right now we are under the annual risk, and there are not many options that right now we can solve. So, right now we need to overcome this kind of situation. But something that I really worry about is that once this kind of situation is getting better, maybe we flex ourselves and then move on to the other problems, and we are going to forget everything. So that's something that I really want to emphasize. The first one, to avoid this kind of situation, first thing we need to do is we need to diversify our energy sources. That's the first thing. Of course, Middle East Asia countries is selling their product at a very kind of relatively cheaper price compared to the other countries like Canada or United States or Australia or Africa, Russia, I don't know. But if we make individual deals with the other countries, maybe it will be a little bit expensive than our concentrated deals with the Middle East Asia countries. But we can just think of it as just the premium for the insurance. Insurance always guarantees us this stable energy supply, but we need to pay for it, right? So that we need to think of it as we need to pay a little bit of higher price for the diversification. And also, the other thing we need to focus on is we need to secure the strategic reserve. Strategic reserve for the crude oil, I think crude oil would be enough. But especially for the natural gas, I don't really believe that natural gas, we don't have enough reserve for that. Maybe government can step in, but right now private sectors like companies who is playing their role in the petrochemical business, they don't really have a big spot to store their natural gas. And natural gas is actually very important because the natural gas, when we generate our power, the electricity, the nuclear and the renewable would mostly the baseline, but the actual prices for the electricity will be determined by the price of the natural gas. That's why if you don't have natural gas, then we are in danger of the electricity supply as well.
Right,
so, yeah.
I see. Right, we have a bit of time left, Steven, so I'd like to turn into something that is relatively a bit more optimistic. Amid the conflict in the Middle East as well as concerns over energy supplies, South Korea recently marked a milestone in aerospace park. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, the step forward was the KF-21 Borame receiving full combat suitability approval for its interceptor configuration. And so just to boil down the significance here, I would say that it's another step in South Korea transitioning from being a country that imports a lot of its military hardware to a country that can produce, almost all of its needs or a large portion of its needs at home. And this, I think, brings the country closer to being able to export fighter jets. And I think there's a lot of countries in the world who are in that market, and South Korea in the global defense market has this reputation as being able to fill orders quickly, to be accurate and cost effective in how it operates. And so this would just open up a new and an even more kind of higher price value added area of the industry to South Korean producers and create more opportunity in an already flourishing sector of the economy.
Right. Steven, back in April, neighboring Japan, it lifted its long-standing ban on lethal weapons exports, and now quite a number of countries are reportedly eyeing its decommissioned Navy destroyers. Could you tell us a bit about that?
The first thing I would say is that we don't have confirmed reports about this, that there's a lot of this is still at the level of speculation, but yeah, it was a very significant change in Japanese officialdom to make this move towards being able to export weapons. As we know, Japan has a pacifist constitution, and there's this very long-running kind of cultural and historical aversion to being involved in conflicts overseas. And so the relaxation of this law creates opportunities, and it's the Philippines has been mentioned as one possible country that might want to import some of these decommissioned Japanese frigates. And the reason for that is obvious. The Philippines has a smaller military with a more modest budget, and perhaps does not have the infrastructure needed to develop these types of things on its own. And so it could be a timely and a cost-effective way for them to bring in some of Japan's decommissioned vessels. The Japanese government has stipulated that initially, at least, they're going to be quite restricted in how they can export weapons. It's going to be only to, I believe it's U.S. allies and, kind of countries that they see as being on the same side temperamentally and ideologically. And so the Philippines falls into that rubric. It's another U.S. ally. It's another democratic country in Asia. So time will tell if this, I'm interested to see just how far Japan pursues this. Do they pursue this kind of arms export industry with the vigor that South Korea has, or are they a little more reluctant? The Takaichi administration has, I think, a lot more political capital than a Japanese administration has had in a while. The prime minister herself has a pretty high approval rating and has carved out a pretty influential space in the Diet and in society quite generally. She's operating with some wind in her sails, so I'm interested to see what she does.
Right, and keeping in mind this potential, and I say competition from neighboring Japan, Professor Yu, what is the work ahead for South Korea as it seeks to maintain or even expand its presence in the global defense market?
So in terms of the work ahead, we need to do is, I'm an economist, so defense market is a little bit, it's quite different from the other normal markets. Because in the normal market, we usually just compare the prices and we buy the product that's with a decent quality. But in a defense market, there are so many other things we need to consider of that. Such as like government relationship, whether that the seller is providing us the like a technology transfer, and also the training program is also can be critical. Or there are so many things that will be involved. And also, if you include everything in details, then governments, the deal between the government will be very huge. It's not just the buy and selling of this very small size of the product. So I believe that recently, and you also mentioned about the Japanese case, and recently also Korea has lost their deal in with some other countries like France, I don't remember, but I think that loss actually is coming from the strategic and diplomatic defeats, not just the engineering one. Of course, Korea can be able to, they can build the ships or other kinds of weapons in a very cost-efficient way. But if we cannot sell this kind of product in a good condition to other countries, then we cannot really sell it. Like if you don't have a great conditions such as like binding agreements to protect their countries or stable supply of the components, these kind of things, then that's something that we need to should be prepared. So first of all, I need to. Because your question was about the work ahead, we need to do something. So the first thing that I want to really emphasize is that the coordination of the government, like ministries. Right now, Ministry of Defense Acquisition and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Strategy, and also even the government office is now their role is now right now is really mixed, and there is no control tower right now. So all offices tries to get their credit when the deal is made, but they don't really take the responsibility when the deal is screwed up. So that's something that I really emphasize, that who should be in charge for that deal. And also the second thing is we need to be prepare for the how the financing can be made. Like we need to make a low interest rate and the longer duration of the repayment, and also government-backed security is the one thing that we need to prepare. I heard that many other developed countries like German and France is very good at those kind of preparing those financial conditions. So that's one thing the Bank of Export and Import is the sort of agent who should prepare for it.
Right.
Yeah. So.
I'm afraid that we have very little time left, but it's a great input, of course, and insight. We need to have better coordination among the government entities and better conditions then.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Yu, for your thoughts. And Steven, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching.